About 50 years ago, an astronaut returning from the moon experienced things that he couldn't find a scientific explanation for. So, with some colleagues, he launched a new science focused on the mind and how it works in the body and across space and time. It's the field of Noetics, where the tools of modern science are used to help us understand how what we think and feel affects us and the world around us. Now, this is Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments from the studios of KXCR Community Radio in Florence, Oregon.
This is Noetic Moments, the show that explores what consciousness is, what it does, how it works, and how our lives could be much fuller if we understood it better. I am Ruth Miller, a longtime student of consciousness, cybernetics, and culture, and through this series of programs, I'm introducing some of the people whose work has defined this field of research, and I'm explaining some of their ideas and experiments. I'll also explore some relevant news items, new research, and I'll answer questions that you send to my email address, ruth@noeticmoments.org. Noetic is spelled Noetic. Now, through this series of programs, we've learned that although the medical world defines consciousness as what we are aware of in the moment, most of what goes on in the mind is not in our conscious awareness at all, but goes on in other aspects of consciousness. Besides our normal awareness, which we call the conscious mind, there's what keeps our bodies going and includes our fears and beliefs about threats and dangers, the subconscious mind, and what keeps us connected with our highest ideals and guides us in our actions, the superconscious mind. We learned that we can change our state of consciousness so we're aware of different aspects of mind at different times. And then we learned that the brain modifies whatever sensory signals it receives to fit past patterns of experience, following a default network or structure in the brain. This means that we perceive, we see, hear, taste, feel, and smell what our brains expect to experience based on the past. We've learned that no one has yet been able to pinpoint just how ideas and thoughts are formed in brain tissue, and we've seen that our body often responds faster than nerve impulses or chemicals can travel, often before we're aware of it. Some experiments have even demonstrated that a person's mind continues to function long after the brain and the heart have been flatlined and the person has been declared dead. Based on all of this, many scientists have come to accept that what we call mind is not the product of the electrochemical activity of the cells making up the brain, but is, in fact, the activity of a field that surrounds and permeates the brain and the body. It's possible to measure at least a portion of this field as electromagnetic activities for several inches around the body in what some say is an egg shape, extending from below our knees to a few inches above our heads. Mind, then, is a field, a pattern of energy that exists whether the body is functioning or not, and permeates and develops with the body and the brain. Now, this means that the brain is best understood as a receiver-transmitter, receiving messages from the mind and transmitting them to the body, and receiving messages from the organs and the senses and transmitting them to the body as the subconscious mind. Some researchers are exploring how the two hemispheres of our brain are involved in this transmitting and receiving from the world primarily through the left hemisphere and somehow connecting with our mind through the right hemisphere. We've learned that this field of mind affects energy and matter in a variety of ways. For example, those subatomic building blocks of the universe show up as energy or matter in quantum physics experiments depending on whether a mind is present to observe them. People's bodies and their pets have been observed to change when someone they're connected with turns attention their way, no matter how far away they are. Individuals and the collective human mind change the readouts from random number generators on computers, as demonstrated on the network computers run by the Global Consciousness Project. Now, every field is a unique pattern of vibration that's different from other fields. And these fields can vibrate along similar patterns, resonating with each other, affecting each other across space and time, which explains pets and bodies reacting across space and time. As a result, a growing number of scientists are seeing our individual mind as part of a larger field. They're beginning to equate mind with the quantum field, or zero-point field, out of which all matter and energy arise. And some researchers are using the equations of quantum mechanics, relativity, and computer learning algorithms to describe the role of consciousness in the formation of matter. Together, these understandings help explain things like the law of attraction, how the world around us mirrors what our consciousness is focused on, how we can access information through insight, intuition, and channeling, how dreams affect our bodies and our mind, how music affects the brain and the body and connects us with other minds, how we can enhance or slow down healing through our thoughts, emotions, and visualizations, and how the belief in a treatment can help a patient experience healing in the placebo effect, how remote viewing can work, how telekinesis works, and how we can get into a state of flow in which the mind and the brain are in sync, maximizing our effectiveness in whatever we're focused on. And finally, how our thoughts and emotions affect our overall well-being. Lately, we've been looking at various forms of brain research, discovering what are called neuronal correlates between the brain activity and the mind. You can catch up on our past shows on our website, www.noeticmoments.org, where you'll also find links to the clips and the books and the authors that I mention. Today, we're going to take a look at something called the vagus nerve. We talked about it a while back. This is actually a collection of nerves, or a nerve system, that runs from basically the base of the skull to almost the pelvis and affects all the organs along the way. Deepak Chopra, the famous endocrinologist who's helped people wake up to these whole new ways of thinking and feeling in his books, Quantum Healing and more, is going to explain some of what the vagus nerve can be and what we can do with it.
When you look at the parasympathetic nervous system, as you know, there's one nerve that dominates, the longest nerve in the body, the vagus nerve, which is the longest nerve in our body. Now, in the Vedic traditions, in the yogic traditions, that's the healing nerve. So it comes from your midbrain, and first it interferes with the oculomotor nerve. So by doing eye exercises, you can actually stimulate the vagus nerve just by doing eye movements. And, you know, the eyes, everybody knows, are the kind of windows to the soul, at least metaphorically speaking. The eyes can give away whether you're frustrated, you're angry, you're happy, or whether you slept well or you have a hangover. It's all in the eyes. Okay, so then the vagus nerve interacts with the facial nerve, and there are 43 facial muscles in our face that express every single human emotion. So you can look at facial expressions and figure out the emotions that a person has. Then the vagus nerve goes to the laryngeal nerve, and it interacts and it influences tone of voice. And you can tell by tone of voice a person's mood. A baby can tell that, you know, mother's happy, mother's upset, mother's frustrated, etc. After that, the vagus nerve influences the depth of breathing, and then heart rate variability. Then it pierces the diaphragm and it innervates all the organs in our body, the hollow organs and the solid organs. And then it influences even the microbiome. And as you know, there's bilateral traffic between vagus nerve. So everything you can do to stimulate the vagus nerve is a healing response. Eye exercises, facial exercises, including smiling, by the way, singing and chanting will stimulate the vagus nerve. We've recently developed a little apparatus which is similar to your earpods that you're using, and that stimulates the auricular branch of the vagus nerve. And then, deep breathing, heart rate heart awareness, meditation, yoga. If you do the 35 or so postures of yoga, forward bends, backward bends, sitting postures, standing postures, twists, you stimulate every branch of the vagus nerve. And then, of course, if you have a diet that's maximum diversity of plant-based foods, 7 colors of the rainbow and 6 tastes of life, you stimulate the vagus nerve, you correct inflammation of the microbiome. So every technique of healing in yoga and Ayurveda is parasympathetic stimulation. Now, we don't use those terms. They use different terms. And then there are all these other techniques, emotional intelligence, social intelligence, breathing techniques, mind-body coordination techniques, meditation, focused awareness, and what we call transcendence. You put them all together, you're evoking the healing response.
So this nerve is not by any means just about the brain. It's about the whole body. It starts with what's going on in the brain, and there's back and forth communication all the way through the torso, through all the organs, through most of the muscles. All this communication going back and forth. It's reminiscent of the HeartMath Institute's results that say there's actually more information sent from the heart to the brain than there is from the brain to the heart. It's part of how we came to understand that the brain isn't running the show. So this nerve is stimulated by all these activities that Chopra listed. And when it is stimulated, it is what's called the parasympathetic nervous system, which encourages relaxation in the face of distress, which encourages calm decision-making. Another way to think of it is it encourages the mind to be what's running the show, rather than the fear-based amygdala and fundamental fear responses that we have been taught must be our reaction in distress. So what Chopra is telling us is that the healing process is in large part managed by this nerve that we call the vagus nerve, or this system that we call the parasympathetic system. And that then allows us to experience a more complete whole beingness. The other thing that it allows us to do and be is much more resilient in the face of distress. And there's a lot of work going on in Europe on that subject. And I'm going to draw on a Der Welt, the World documentary from Germany to explore this aspect of what's going on here.
When we experience stress, the brain is activated. This sets off a complex cascade of events. In the brain, stress signals are sent to the hypothalamus. This, in turn, releases hormones that make their way to the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland then releases its hormones to the adrenal cortex, which instructs our bodies to make extra cortisol to deal with the stress. Cortisol allows all the cells in our body to flood with additional energy to aid in the fight or flight response.
Cortisol is our main stress hormone, and it travels to all organs in the body. It's very important that we are well prepared for a stressful event.
Cortisol binds to receptors in our cells, and that's a good thing, because the receptors then report back to the brain. Thank you, we have enough cortisol bound here now. The stress response is then switched off in the brain, and we calm down again, at least when everything's functioning correctly.
Many people are nervous at interviews, but normally, when the situation is over, our stress hormone levels should down-regulate again. People with this particular genotype are not so good at this, so for them, the stress hormone stays higher for longer.
The question Binda asks is, why is that? Why are some people not as good at calming down than others? And this is where genetics come into play. One of the genes responsible for our stress regulation is the FKBP5 gene. It's activated during stress and ensures that an important enzyme is released. It has the same name as its corresponding gene, FKBP5. The problems start when too much of it is released. Then, the enzyme wedges its way between the stress receptor and the cortisol, and thus blocks the stress receptor's message to the brain that there's enough cortisol. The brain is misinformed. It keeps firing, and we can no longer calm down.
We think that stress causes too much of this FKBP5 to be released, and that people simply release too much of the stress hormone even after the slightest stress. And we know that too much of this stress hormone in the long term is bad for many processes, including the brain, which also increases the risk of psychiatric illnesses.
So stress is too much of the wrong chemical in the wrong place at the wrong time because the brain didn't get the signal. Well, if you just tuned in, you are listening to Noetic Moments, a radio show exploring what consciousness is, how it works, and how our lives can be greatly enhanced as we understand it more fully. I am Ruth Miller, your host, and that sound tells me it's time to shift gears, to look at a book and answer any questions you email to ruth@noeticmoments.org, and maybe look at news or some other thing that helps us understand the role our state of consciousness plays in our experience. Well, we've been looking at the role the vagus nerve plays in the management of stress and resilience in the human body and in the body of mice in the experiment in Germany. And what we are seeing is that Deepak Chopra is showing us that the various ways that yogis and Ayurvedic practitioners have been encouraging people to be healthy are, in fact, ways to stimulate the vagus nerve, which actually reduces stress and increases resilience in the body. What's needed, and what these exercises tend to do, is to help us turn off that signal, rewire the brain, and reset the gene that has been generating too much of the enzyme that prevents the cell from telling the brain there's enough here. Fascinating. And all of that is under control of the mind when the mind is being allowed to run the body, or at least direct the brain how to run the body, which again, all of those procedures and exercises and processes that Chopra talked about facilitate. And if you'd like to learn more about that, you may like to explore a book by Stanley Rosenberg called Accessing the Healing Power of the Vagus Nerve. Subtitle is Self-Help Exercises for Anxiety, Depression, Trauma, and Autism. It's a paperback that came out in December 2017. It's available in all the usual places, and the description says, this comprehensive guide offers an easy-to-understand overview of the vagus nerve and helps you unlock your body's innate capacity to heal from stress, trauma, anxiety, and injury. Looking at the book, it's fairly lengthy, but that's not too surprising because it's offering us quite a bit. In the table of contents, we get a couple of forewords, we get the usual acknowledgments, and part 1 says, Anatomical Facts, Old and New, the Polyvagal Theory. Now, polyvagal theory has been emerging only in the last 10 years or so, and it is part of how people discovered that when we're under stress, we don't just go to fight or flight, we may also go to freeze. And a lot of research is suggesting that when some people, especially women, are attacked, they don't fight, they don't fly, they freeze. They got no tools, and they just freeze. And that this is part of why they become so vulnerable to some forms of attack. So polyvagal theory helps us to understand a lot of the things that Chopra told us earlier. So that's chapter 1. Chapter 2 is to get to know your autonomic nervous system, which the vagus nerve is the core of. Chapter 2 is more aspects of the polyvagal theory. Chapter 3 helps us to understand the relationship between nerves and behaviors, or what's actually happening in the cells. It's neuroception. And then we look at the various branches of the vagus nerve and what the problems are when they're not functioning. Chapter 6, I skipped a couple, goes to somatic psychological problems. And that's what the woman was talking about in Germany, what she was calling psychiatric illnesses. And Chapter 7 addresses autism spectrum disorders, that if one is actually working with the vagus nerve appropriately, there are things that can be done to assist those who have been caught on that spectrum. And then Part 2 is a bunch of exercises. There's a basic one. There are neurofacial release techniques. And facial, I'm not talking about the face. I'm talking about fascia. Those are locked places in the muscles. If you've had a massage and they suddenly come to this place and it's hard or it's painful, that's usually a fascia. There's an exercise called the salamander exercises, massage for migraines, 4-minute natural facelift, addressing the many, many aspects of this incredible nervous system in the body that he's actually calling a hydra because it has all these different arms extending through the various parts of the body. He says the common thread across all of this may be a simple one. All of the problems in the list occur at least partly from dorsal vagal activity, which is activation of the spinal sympathetic nervous system, and can be addressed by reinstating normal function of the ventral vagus nerve branch and the other nerves that are required. In Chapter 1, he talks about the 12 cranial nerves, the various function of all of those nerves, and he goes on from there to go through the anatomy and the physiology involved in all of these nerves. Now, Stanley Rosenberg is a body therapist. He's one of these people who was practicing craniosacral therapy in the 80s. And he came up with a whole system of working with the crane and the sacral area. He led a school in Denmark as well as the U.S., teaching structural integration, myofascial release of scar tissue, biomechanical, craniosacral therapy, and more. He's written several books. One is called Nevermore, Pain in the Back, Nevermore Stiff Neck, Pain Release with Osteomassage, and a description of Tai Chi called Hua Yu Tai Chi. So if you heard something in what Chopra was saying or what you heard in the study of resilience, this book, Accessing the Healing Power of the Vagus Nerve, may be a very useful one for you. Well, in other news, continuing in our exploration of the brain, the Journal of Neuroscience has been analyzing what's called the white matter in that part of the brain that is in the upper portions in the cortex. It says that previous studies have shown that superagers are able to resist typical age-related changes in gray matter, and there hasn't been much work done on white matter. Scientists analyzed the white matter of superagers over a 5-year span and compared them with typical older adults. And researchers collected MRI data and to see what was going on in different parts of the brain and the microstructure. The microstructure is not those folds that you see when you see a picture of the brain. And it's not just the neurons. It's the structure that allow the neurons to communicate within the folds of the brain. The lead author on this study, Marta Garro, said that, quote, the study has found a better preservation of white matter microstructure over time in superagers when compared to an elderly control group with normal memory for their age. This can be interpreted as superagers can avoid the normal aging changes that occur in that microstructure. An old person can naturally age with excellent memory. This is key when trying to fight against the pathological deterioration of memory. They explored what contributes to mental decline, and they're suggesting, based on a previous study using the same cohort of superagers have better mobility, better mental health, less glucose disorders and hypertension problems, and a higher interest in music. We cannot say that controlling all these factors will help you become superagers, since we cannot infer causality from this correlative study. Nevertheless, they say, these findings point out that having good mental and physical health, as well as having hobbies, and music, as we discovered earlier in our show, can be a very powerful hobby to help with the brain function. Those who use their brain more, they say, especially for high-level cognitive tasks, may be more likely to show greater white matter integrity. So if you are concerned about losing your memory capacity, just keep on living a healthy, active life and be involved in a lot of things. Listen to music. You might even try learning to play or sing or do something musical with your body and mind, and you may find that you become a superager. Well, that's it for today's show. We're out of time for today, but remember, you can continue the exploration. You can listen to SoundCloud. All of our shows are streaming on SoundCloud. You can go to the archives on KXCR.net, or you can go to our website, www.noeticmoments.org, where there are links to archived past shows, along with titles and other resources that we refer to on the show, and where you can send me your comments and questions, which I will do my best to get answered the next time we're on the air. For now, thanks for joining me here on Noetic Moments, recorded in the studios of KXCR Community Radio in Florence, Oregon. And have a wonderful week.
You've been listening to Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments. This program is produced in the studios of KXCR Community Radio in beautiful Florence, Oregon, supported by you, our listeners. Our theme music is Tumbling Planets, composed and performed by Jeff Lovejoy. To hear this program again or learn more about Noetic Sciences, search our website, www.noeticmoments.org.